What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, I'm in the mood to show you a game where Magnus Carlsen disrespects Vladimir Kramnik on move 2 using the Trompowsky opening. This game is Magnus versus Vladimir from the 2013 Tal Memorial. And here we go. In the game, Magnus Carlsen opens 1d4, Vladimir goes knight to f6, and then on move 2, Magnus does play the move bishop g5. This is the Trompowsky opening, and this has to be one of the most disrespectful openings you can play. Personally, I think it is very appropriate given that Vladimir has been quite disrespectful lately, calling everyone cheaters. I mean, someone's got to accuse this guy sooner or later. All right, in the game, Vladimir plays arguably the main line these days, d5, and then followed by c5, breaking in the queen's side in the spirit of the queen's gambit. All right, now Magnus, he does play the typical Trompowsky move. He takes that knight on f6, bishop takes f6, permanently damaging the black pawn structure. And now Vladimir does have a big choice. Do you want to recapture with that g-pawn or the e-pawn? Well, in the game, he does go g takes f6, when it turns out e takes is actually a little more precise here. Now here, Magnus, he does take that pawn on c5, d takes c5. Maybe he will try to hang on to it later, or maybe he'll give it back, but play for, a good position anyway. All right, now Vladimir, e6, intending bishop takes c5, and this is one of Magnus Carlsen's last chances to hang on to that pawn with, say, b4 or something similar, and in the game, he does not do that. He gives it up to black, knight to f3 is the move, and now we have just knight d7 from Vladimir, perhaps intending bishop takes c5 or knight takes, recapturing with the knight. We'll have to wait and find out. Now here, Magnus, c4 is the move, gaining space on the queen side. The idea being if black takes the pawn, he will recapture with the bishop, and c4 will be an excellent square for that light squared bishop. Now here, d takes c4 and then c6 by Magnus, hoping Vladimir does take with b takes c6, at which point his pawn structure on the queen side would be permanently damaged. Now, instead of that, in the game, Vladimir, he plays the much stronger idea. That is just knight to b6, opting not to recapture that pawn immediately, instead swinging the knight over to the queen's side. The point being now that knight does control that pawn on the c-file, and beyond that, if white goes c takes b7, then bishop takes b7, regains the lost pawn, and that bishop will be tremendously placed on that b7 square, slicing down the board. And now, yes, Vladimir, his queenside pawn structure would be a little bit weaker, but overall, that is a small price to pay to have that very active bishop on b7 and that knight on b6, guarding that c4 square perfectly. Now here, Magnus, he does not take on b7. Instead, the move is knight b to d2, jumping in with the knight, pressuring c4 once again. Now the threat is knight takes c4, at which point he is threatening knight takes b6 and so on. Now here, Vladimir, again, instead of b takes c6, he plays the move c3 himself. The exact same idea Magnus just played a few moves prior. Again, the point being, if you recapture that pawn with the b pawn, then you do weaken your queenside pawns permanently. And however, here, unfortunately, Magnus, he does not have that bishop on c1. Therefore, the idea of not capturing on c3 really isn't an option. If you go, say, knight b3, then c takes b2 would be devastating. So with that in mind here, b takes c3 is virtually forced. Kramnik does the same. B takes c6, and now we do have sort of a symmetrical pawn structure on the queen side. However, the big imbalance in this game, of course, is the fact that white traded his Trompowsky bishop on f6 for the knight, damaging black's pawn structure, but in the process giving Vladimir those two bishops. So overall, the game is roughly level, but we do have a major imbalance on the board, and that will make for a very interesting game. All right, now Magnus, queen to c2 is the move, delaying the development of his light squared bishop, and now bishop g7 for Vladimir, opting to put his bishop on g7 instead of, say, d6, where it would be a little more centrally placed. And the benefit of having it on g7, of course, it does increase the defense of the king side quite a bit. And once Vladimir does go f5, that will be one of the main ideas in this position. That bishop will be tremendously active on this long diagonal. All right, now Magnus, bishop d3, pressuring h7. Of course, now, short castles is not an option, as after short castles, you just take that free pawn on h7, and after king to h8, you swoop back the bishop back to, say, d3 or e4, and you win the pawn for free. Therefore, here, Vladimir, he cannot castle yet. Instead, the move is f5, gaining space on the king side, and now we can castle on the next move, as again, that pawn on h7 will not be hanging, as this diagonal here has been blocked off by that pawn. All right, now here, Magnus, e4, gaining space in the center, and Vladimir swoops in with the queen to f6, putting pressure on that pawn on c3. Now, rook c1 defends the pawn on c3, and finally, both sides do castle. Castles and castles on the board. And now here, once again, the main imbalance in this middle game is the fact that Vladimir has those two Bs on c8 and g7, whereas White's pawn structure is a little bit better, or at least it will be. For example, after, say, f takes e4, then knight takes, White will have those 3 pawn islands versus the 1, 2, 3, 4 of Vladimir Kramnik. Now here, Kramnik, c5, gaining space on the queen side, and rook f to e1 for Magnus, centralizing his rook. So far, Magnus is playing excellently in this game, and overall, the game is still very, very level. Now Vladimir, rook d8, sliding over the rook, a4 for Magnus, gaining space on the queen side, the alpha 0 a pawn entering the game. Potentially, Magnus is threatening a5, maybe even a6, trying to lock down the queen side. Now here, Vladimir, c4, gaining space himself and driving back the bishop. And now here, very importantly, that pawn on c4 is technically hanging. For example, White can go knight takes, then bishop takes, just winning that pawn for free. So here, Vladimir Kramnik playing a very interesting pawn sacrifice. And believe it or not, Magnus, he does not take that pawn. Instead, bishop f1 is the move. Now, of course, he still can take on c4 later with the knight, but this was a very interesting development. And now, of course, Vladimir, he's going to take on e4, f takes e4, and if you recapture with the knight, then the idea of knight takes c4 won't be a good option later in the game, and that is what happens. So knight takes e4, Vladimir getting away with his temporary pawn sacrifice, playing c5, c4, and now the material is still level for a little while. All right, Vladimir, queen to f5, pinning that knight on e4, as if it moves the queen on c2, could be traded off. And although it's not a real pin, as the queen isn't hanging yet, the rook on c1 does defend the queen. If the rook moves in the future, that could be a big problem. Now here, Magnus, he knows that. He goes knight d4, both hitting the queen on f5 and defending the queen on c2 with yet another piece. A very good multi-purpose move by Magnus. Now here, Vladimir, he is sick and tired of Magnus Carlsen's games. He trades his bishop, his very important dark squared bishop, for that knight on d4. Bishop takes d4, then c takes, and then bishop b7. Vladimir putting a lot of pressure on that knight on e4. Is it going to move? Is it going to stay there? Well, it turns out in the game it does move. Knight to c5 is the move for Magnus, pressuring that hanging bishop on b7, but offering the queen trade. And here, Vladimir, he does go for the endgame. Vladimir being an excellent endgame player himself. Maybe not the greatest endgame player of all time like Magnus Carlsen, but he's still pretty good. So here, queen takes c2, then rook takes, and then bishop c6, defends the bishop. Very good move by Vladimir, noticing the bishop was hanging, not giving up his pieces for free. Now here, Magnus, a5, the alpha 0 a pawn marching down the board. Very important, as that pawn was quite vulnerable on a4, so both a good defensive and offensive move here. Now, very importantly, if Vladimir moves that knight, say, I don't know, knight to c8, knight d7, those options are very, very passive. That pawn on c4 will hang, and Magnus will be doing excellent after, say, rook takes c4, regaining that pawn and defending the other pawn on d4. Now here, Vladimir, he knows that, and he finds an absolutely brilliant move in this position. I am not exaggerating. And if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video and try to find the key idea for Vladimir right here in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, Vladimir, he finds a very powerful move. Rook takes d4, and no, this is not a knight sacrifice, as he will be regaining that lost piece. All right, here, Magnus, he does take on b6. A takes b6, and then we have a takes b6 back, and the new b pawn is pressuring that knight on c5. And check this out. That knight on c5 is trapped. It has nowhere to go. Everywhere on the a file, this pawn controls both b3 and d3. Beyond that, squares like e4, e6, d7 and b7, they are all covered. No matter where it goes, that knight is going to be lost. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he finds the best move in this position. That is just gobbling up a free pawn before you do lose the knight once and for all. So knight takes e6, of course, is the move. Then we have f takes e6, then bishop takes c4. And now here, the dust has settled. We have an endgame. Both sides have those two rooks and the bishop. However, the big difference here is Magnus Carlsen does have a much better pawn structure. He has one pawn island versus the 1, 2, 3 of Vladimir. And yes, even though the pawn on the b file is a pass pawn, these pawns are just so incredibly weak here, and they will be targets for all of Magnus Carlsen's pieces, especially that pawn on e6, currently being attacked twice. That will be very difficult to defend. Now here, Vladimir, bishop d7, trying his best to defend, but now h3 for Magnus, just getting rid of the idea of a back rank mating threat. For example, after bishop takes, then rook takes, then rook d1 would be a back rank mate after rook to e1, and then rook takes e1. So h3, very solid move, guarding against all kinds of back rank mating ideas. Now Vladimir, king to f7, defending that pawn once again. Thanks to his tricky back rank idea, he has defended that pawn for now. But of course, Magnus, he is not done. Bishop b3, rerouting the bishop. Now we have king to e7, rook c to e2, again piling up pressure on that pawn. That pawn now being pinned to the king on e7. That is not a good place to be for Vladimir. All right, now rook d6 defends the pawn, rook to e4, swinging up the rook. Now the rook has access to both h4 and b4, where it can pressure either of these pawns on b6 or h7. Now here, rook to a3, Vladimir flying in with the rook, pressuring the bishop. Rook 1 to e3 defends the bishop. And of course, again, the king always has h2. It's a good escape square if it needs it. All right, now Vladimir, h5, gaining space on the king side, trying to defend. But that is just a juicy target for that rook on e4. And Magnus does swing it over. So rook to h4, pressures the pawn on h5. Vladimir must defend. He goes bishop to e8, defending with the bishop. But now Magnus, king to h2. The king march has begun. He's intending perhaps king g3, centralizing his king. Now Vladimir, bishop g6. Again, his only hope right here is to passively defend. Magnus knows that. He increases the pressure on the queen side, rook to b4, both attacking that pawn on b6 and defending the bishop. That means the other rook is now free to move without losing the bishop on b3. Now, Vladimir, king to f6, marching down the king, king g3 and e5. Vladimir gaining space in the center. Now we have king to h4, the king being a fighting piece already in the game. And here Vladimir, he tries to trade off some pieces. Rook d4 is the move, forking both the rook on b4 and the king on the h4 square. Therefore, rook takes d4 is forced. That is the move. Then we have e takes and rook to e6, flying in with the rook. And now that pawn on b6 is just a goner. All right, king g7 for Vladimir. Rook takes b6, then d3. Vladimir, he's down a pawn, but that pawn on d3 is now a huge asset. Magnus will have to defend very carefully. All right, bishop d1, sliding back the bishop. Rook to a2, pressures that pawn on the f2 square, and now king g3 does defend. Now here, Vladimir, he has a very big decision to make. What should he be doing here? Well, it turns out he has to sit back and wait. For example, rook to a3, rook a1, and so on. Anything with the rook is virtually fine. However, instead, he makes a big mistake here in the endgame on move 42. He does play the move h4, driving down that alpha 0 h-pawn. Normally, I am a huge fan of the move h4 for white or for black. However, here, it doesn't quite work out. Here, white just takes that pawn. King takes h4, black does take on f2. That was the idea of h4, the deflection sacrifice. You do regain that pawn on the f2 square, but it turns out this is to Magnus Carlsen's benefit, as he now has those two protected pass pawns on the king side. Those pawns will be a huge asset. Now here, king g3 drives back the rook, and now Vladimir, he must go rook to a2. That is his best chance to defend in the endgame, but instead rook to f6, offering the rook trade. Vladimir Kramnik, don't you know it's always easier to defend in the endgame when you have rooks on the board? That always makes it easier. All rook endgames are drawn. Vladimir Kramnik, he forgot this rule. He offers the rook trade, and here Magnus, he is oh too happy to accept this offer. So Magnus, rook takes f6, then king takes, and then king to f4. Here Magnus, that pawn on d3 is as good as gone. His plan is simple. King to e3, king to d2, perhaps swinging around the bishop somewhere and winning that pawn sooner or later. Now here Vladimir, d2, pushing the pawn down the board yet again, and now it cannot be defended by the bishop. Therefore, again, that pawn is as good as gone. King to e3, king e5, and now g3. Magnus opting not to regain the pawn yet, instead blocking off all the dark squares on the king side, trying to prevent ideas like king to f4. That would put a wrench in his plans. Now bishop f5 pressures the pawn on h3, but h4 defends. Now bishop e6, Vladimir waits, and finally king takes d2. That pawn is gone. And now we're going to see just some brilliant endgame technique by Magnus Carlsen in the endgame. He's going to find a brilliant way to try and push these pawns down the board. And can Vladimir Kramnik hold on, or will it be too much? Let's find out. King to e4, Vladimir jumping in with the king. King e2, bishop g4, hits the king. King e1 defends the bishop. bishop e6, and king to f2. Now Vladimir, sooner or later, he must drive back the king. If he doesn't go, say, king e5 right away, then bishop f3 will force the issue. Therefore, king to e5 by Vladimir, king e3, marching up with the king, bishop d7, bishop c2, blocking off these light squares, and now bishop g4, trying to set up some sort of blockade, but Magnus is having none of it. Bishop g6, again locking down these light squares on the king side, bishop d7, and now h5. Magnus finding a way to push the pawns down the board. Now we have king to f6, king f4, the bishop being defended by the pawn, of course, and now bishop e6, bishop e4, king g7, and king to g5. Now bishop d7, h6 hits the king must move, king to h8, king f4, bishop e6, bishop f5, bishop f7, and g4. Now the plan is simple. Perhaps g5, then g6, again pushing the pawns down the board. Now Vladimir, bishop h5, trying to defend, and this is a very tricky move. Here the point being, if g takes h5, the bishop does not control the queening square, and that means Vladimir can go back and forth here, back and forth, and the game will be a draw. Therefore, Magnus, he knows that. He does not take the bishop. Instead, g5 is the move, the right idea. Now, king g8, bishop b6, king h7, and king to f5. The king march has begun yet again. Now, bishop g6 hits the king to f6, king h8, bishop d7, perhaps intending bishop e8 in the future. Now, bishop h5, bishop c6, king h7, bishop d5, a very strong move. Now we have bishop g6, and here the finishing blow for Magnus, a brilliant move. Bishop to g8, the deflection sacrifice. The point being, of course, the king cannot maintain the defense of the bishop. Once you take it, for example, king takes, and then the finishing sequence could be, for example, king to h8, king f6, king g8, perhaps g6, king to h8, g7, king g8, h7, king takes, and then king to f7, and the pawn would promote. So for that reason, way back here, Vladimir Kramnik resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Vladimir Kramnik, where Magnus disrespects Vladimir on move 2 with the Trompowsky attack. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this video right here, where Vladimir Kramnik played maybe his best game of all time against Magnus Carlsen. That was a brutal, brilliant attacking game. If you love aggressive attacking chess, you will love that video. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.